Okay, so this is chapter 8, where we will be talking about photosynthesis. And in chapter 6 and in chapter 7, we briefly mentioned photosynthesis. And so remember that photosynthesis is going to be an anabolic reaction where we're building up a larger molecule from smaller molecules. Specifically, we're going to build up glucose and other organic molecules from carbon dioxide. Okay, and so I'll show you the reaction equation in just a second. But it is an anabolic buildup process. It is also endergonic, which means that it requires energy. And so we're going to see in just a minute that that energy is going to come from the sun. So let's jump right into this. So on this first slide here, this is a map of Earth, and it is showing the Earth's distribution of photosynthetic activity. And so in the ocean, so in aquatic environments, we look to the left here at this scale, and this shows ocean chlorophyll A concentration. And so chlorophyll A, we're going to learn, is a pigment molecule. It is the main pigment molecule of photosynthesis. It's responsible for absorbing sunlight, and then after it's absorbed by that pigment molecule, it will then be turned into organic molecules, into chemical energy, stored in the bonds of organic molecules. And so you can see in aquatic environments, there's some concentration, a lot of blue zones. Now there are regions where we get a little bit of a higher concentration. And if you look, at regions kind of close to land, you can see even some orange, yellow, orange, and red zones. And so photosynthesis is happening in aquatic environments. It's also happening on land. So over here on the right shows relative amount of land vegetation. Okay, and so on the planet, we have areas that are going to have low or minimum levels of vegetation. And so we can see some of those regions here in these yellowy browns. And then we have regions of the planet where you can see like this here, a lot of vegetation. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite way that the scale runs here. So over here in the greens to almost a bluish gray color is going to be maximum amount of vegetation. And so photosynthesis is happening all over the planet. Okay, so here is an overview of what's going to happen in this process. And so we're going to take energy from the sun, not we, photosynthetic organisms, and they're going to convert that energy. So remember the first law of thermodynamics says energy cannot be created nor can it be destroyed. It can only be transferred and transformed. So here it's being transformed. So it's going to be captured. Okay, so energy from the sun will be captured, and then it's going to be transformed into energy stored in the bonds of food, like glucose. Glucose represents chemical energy, which again is a source of potential energy. So between those bonds, between the carbon atoms, that's where the stored energy is. Okay, we already learned back in chapter 7 that glucose and other organic molecules can be broken down, and the energy that's stored, chemical potential energy, can be pulled out and made into ATP. Okay, all life on the planet depends on this process. So what's going to happen in this process is carbon from the atmosphere in the form of CO2 gets captured by photosynthetic organisms and made into, again, molecules like glucose, right? So organic molecules. And so not only is it a stored source of potential energy, it's also our source of carbon. Okay, so all the carbon that makes up all of the other organic molecules, so all of our carbohydrates, our nucleic acids, our proteins, and our fats, I was missing the last one, our lipids, those are all carbon-based, right? We talked about those back in chapter 3. Where does that carbon come from? It comes from, plants that are and other photosynthetic organisms that are able to capture carbon. Okay, so all of the carbon that we have, used in building those organic molecules come from this process. So we get carbon, we get stored potential energy, we also get oxygen. And so we'll see oxygen as a byproduct of this process. Okay, in some Again, energy of sunlight is captured. It's used to energize electrons, and we're going to see this process. And then that energy ends up being converted and stored in the chemical bonds of glucose molecules. This process powers about 99% of Earth's ecosystems. There are some organisms that can do, that are chemotrophs. They can, chemoautotrophs. They do not use sunlight. We're not going to actually talk about them. So about 99% of Earth's ecosystems depend on this process. Okay, so what kind of organisms can do photosynthesis? So plants, right? Algae, green photosynthetic algae, cyanobacteria. Okay, so in this first picture here, I've got a picture of a fern. You've probably all seen this plant before. Here we've got an algal bloom. And over here, we've got some cyanobacteria. So what do they all have in common? They're green, right? And so you're going to see that green is because of pigment molecules, chlorophylls. Okay. I want to briefly touch on the difference between photoautotrophs and then heterotrophs. So photoautotrophs, autotrophs are organisms that can make their own food. Photoautotrophs are organisms that make their own food by capturing sunlight. Okay. On the flip side, heterotrophs, these are going to be organisms that are not capable of making their own food. And so they have to obtain food as an energy source and also as a carbon source from organisms that do make their own food. Okay, so organisms like us, right? We don't have the capability of making our own food. We can't capture carbon. We can't capture sunlight. Okay, so how do we get energy? We eat stuff, right? So we're either eating organisms that ate plants or we're eating plants directly. And that's where we get our food from. Okay, so here is a beautiful slide showing a really nice overview of how the molecules that are required for photosynthesis get to where they need to get to, and also what gets released. So let me start off first by saying that photosynthesis in plants, the main organ is going to be the green leaves, okay? Roots are not doing photosynthesis. Stems like the one shown here that are covered in bark, there's not going to be photosynthesis happening here. In green stems, photosynthesis will happen. But again, the main organ of photosynthesis are leaves. Okay, so that's going to be taking place up here in this tree. And, you know, if it's a cone-bearing plant that has needles, needles are modified leaves. Okay, so really any green structure on a plant will be involved in photosynthesis. And so again, it's a metabolic pathway, lots of steps. So we're going to talk about those steps, but overall, the substrates, right, the reactant molecules are going to include sunlight. So obviously that's coming from the sun. And we'll talk about that in the next part of the chapter. Sunlight comes down in the form of waves, and those waves possess energy. Okay. What else? Carbon dioxide. So how is carbon dioxide coming in? Again, in the next part of the chapter, actually, no, on the next slide, I forgot where I put it. I'm going to show you a picture of a leaf, and I'm going to show you how carbon dioxide actually comes in through a pore in the leaf called a stomate. Okay. And lastly, water. How does water get up to those leaves? Water is going to come from the ground. Okay. So water is going to be in soil, and roots will be responsible for absorbing that water, and then that water will get transported up the plant, right? Water travels just one way, to where it's going to be used up here in the leaves. Products, so on the other side of the equation. Oxygen, so oxygen gets released, and then oxygen will also leave via a stomate. So I'm going to show you a picture of a stomate on the next slide. Stomates are important in gas exchange. Carbon dioxide comes into the leaf, oxygen leaves the leaf. What else is made as a product are simple sugars. So our carbohydrates like glucose. And those sugars, right, they're either going to be used here where they're made, or they can be transported up or down the plant and stored. Okay. And so again, the leaf is the main organ of photosynthesis, but they're going to be responsible for supplying the whole plant with food. Okay, so here is that equation. And so this should look familiar. It's really the opposite of cellular respiration. And, you know, we even talked about this in chapter 6. So our reactant molecules, of course, are on the left as usual. We've got carbon dioxide. That's my pointer. Carbon dioxide, so we have 6 of those, so 6 CO2, plus water, again, 6 of those, 6 H2O, plus sunlight, there's our energy source, is going to yield sugar, C6H12O6, plus oxygen, and 6 of those, so 6 O2. This, just like cellular respiration, is a redox reaction. Okay, and so there is this reduction and oxidation. And so in this process, what happens is carbon dioxide gets reduced to form glucose, C6H12O6. So it gains electrons and protons, right? And then water is going to get oxidized. So it's going to lose electrons and hydrogens, and it's going to be oxidized to oxygen. Okay, so again, a redox reaction. Okay, so on this next slide here, let me just move my camera. I'm showing you a cartoon image of a leaf and then a transmission electron micrograph of a leaf as well. So we're seeing the inside structure of that leaf. It's pretty cool. So let's come up here first. So the leaf, the outer surface of the leaf on the top is going to be called the upper epidermis, and the outer surface on the bottom of the leaf is going to be called the lower epidermis. Okay, all of the cells in between the upper and lower epidermis are going to be called the mesophyll. And in some leaves, the mesophyll gets split into what's called the palisade and the spongy layer. The cells in here are called parenchyma cells. Okay, and you'll see these green, dots, okay, scattered. Mostly found in mesophyll cells, but also found in some epidermal cells. Those green, kind of circles represent chloroplasts, which we're going to talk more about as the chapter goes on. Chloroplasts are going to be the organelle of photosynthesis. So we say leaves are the main organ of photosynthesis, and inside leaves, photosynthesis is going to take place in the mesophyll cells inside of chloroplasts. Now, carbon dioxide needs to get into the leaf, and oxygen, that waste product, has to get out of the leaf. And so I told you this already, but you can see on the lower epidermis, and depending on the type of leaf we're looking at, sometimes these are also found on the upper epidermis. Here on the lower epidermis, you can see this hole, right, this space between these two epidermal cells. This is called a stoma, okay, or a stomata. And this allows for gas exchange. Okay, flanking this pore, flanking this stomata, are these two cells, which we call guard cells. And guard cells can actually change shape, causing that stomata to either be closed, which would not allow gas exchange, or to open up, which does allow gas exchange. And so again, some plants need to really tightly regulate that. When the stomata are open, leaves also tend to lose water, which can sometimes be a problem. Okay, so gas exchange happens through that stomata. Okay, so that brings us to the chloroplast. So again, this is going to be the organelle of photosynthesis. It is going to be found in green leaves or other green organs of the plant. Sometimes stems, if they're soft stemmed, they will also be green. And so let's take a quick look at this. So just like the mitochondria, the chloroplast is a double membrane organelle. So it has an outer and an inner membrane. Both of them are going to be phospholipid bilayers. There is also a space in between the two, which is labeled here as the intermembrane space. Now on the inside of that inner membrane, there will be a fluid-filled portion. The fluid is called the stroma. So here it says aqueous fluid. Aqueous just means watery. And then we can see these stacks of disc-like structures. So each one of these discs is called a thylakoid. So there's that term thylakoid here. The whole stack of discs is called the granum. And if we take a look at the thylakoid, if we look inside of those, the open space, shown here kind of in this pinkish color, is called the thylakoid lumen, and the lumen is surrounded by the thylakoid membrane. Okay, now the site of photosynthesis, there's two sites. We're going to have a lot of the reactions, at least the whole first part, is going to happen in the thylakoid. Okay, specifically really on the membrane, and there's going to be some stuff that happens in the lumen. And then really the whole second half of photosynthesis will take place in the stroma. Okay, so the inner and outer membrane are not involved here in photosynthesis. It's really the thylakoid membrane and the stroma. Okay. Okay. So here is an overview. And again, in the next two parts of the chapter, we'll focus on these. So we take photosynthesis and we break it up into two main phases or two main reactions. The first is called the light-dependent reaction, and the second can either be called the light-independent reaction, or sometimes it's referred to as the Calvin cycle. Okay, so the first part we'll cover in the next part of the chapter, and this last part we'll cover in the third part of the chapter. So it's broken up nicely. So the light-dependent reactions, as the name implies, need light. Okay, so that's going to be shown here on the left. And so light's going to come in. Light gets absorbed by pigment molecules found in the thylakoid membrane. That light will be converted into ATP and NADPH. Okay, NADPH is NADH's cousin. So NADH, FADH2, NADPH, they all do the same thing. They're going to carry electrons. Okay, so again, energy comes from light. It's captured by pigment molecules, and that energy is going to be transformed into ATP and NADPH. Water will be used in this first step, and oxygen will be released. So oxygen is going to be a byproduct. There it is. The second reaction is going to be called the light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle. And so this part of photosynthesis does not require light. Okay? It can happen in the presence or absence of light. We used to actually call this second phase the dark reactions, which is very misleading. That makes it appear like these have to happen in the dark, and the Calvin cycle can happen in the light or dark, doesn't matter. So what happens here? So the ATP and the NADPH are going to be used here, and CO2 is also required. Okay, and so CO2 is going to get, we say, fixed. So CO2 from the atmosphere, it comes in through a stomate, it ends up in the leaves, it gets delivered to the mesophyll cells, right to that chloroplast. It's going to go into the chloroplast and it's going to enter the Calvin cycle. And then it's going to, ATP and NADPH will be used, and we will generate sugars like glucose, okay, organic molecules. What will also happen is the ATP and NADPH, they get used, and so the products of that will also be produced, which go back and are used in the light reaction. So this NADP plus and ADP and PI, those are the products of the use of these. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. Again, in the next two parts of the chapter, we're going to go through both of these phases in a lot more detail. So that's it for this part.